All right, welcome everybody. This is just a short live chat. I just wanted to talk a little bit about Sam Langford's possible place in the all-time great heavyweight ratings, which are obviously very subjective, person to person. But from what I know of his career, I'm going to take a little stab at it here. I think I'm going to do a longer chat later this week. I don't have a lot of graphics loaded up right now. These are mostly ones from previous live chats, but I just want to talk a little bit about Langford. This is a pre-ratings era career. They can be a little bit tricky, especially as Langford was a weight jumping fighter. So when he was, at the end of a training camp, when he was walking around at the super middleweight limit, he was fighting some guys that were 220, 240. So he's a super middleweight technically, but he's actually fighting at heavyweight. That's one of the confusions about his career, saying, well, he's too small, but his opponents weren't too small. And so if you beat, like when he beat middleweights and super middleweight, what would have been super middleweight, if that had existed at the time, early in his career, there weren't very many divisions at all. And he fought for so long. I mean, he started in 1902. He finally gave it up in 1926 into the ratings era. So although he fought some fighters who became rated, really, he was past his best by the time that was all being worked out, like how to rate fighters. So, most people are familiar with the arguments for the great Muhammad Ali. There are lots of great arguments for him as the all-time great. I have no problem with that. Some people even put him pound for pound. He really was that good that you can make an argument. Fantastic title success, multiple times being able to come back and overcome adversity. And some of his biggest wins, he was the underdog. So it wasn't like he was just, and he wasn't necessarily the largest guy. Well, he definitely wasn't the largest guy in his era. So he beat great fighters that were his own size, also that were larger and smaller than him. So Joe Louis, what a incredible career. And although some of his opponents aren't as famous as Ali's opponents because, it's just a more video-friendly era Ali was in, but Louis fought a ridiculous number of ranked fighters, ranked heavyweights who'd achieved top 10, and many of them even top 3 rating in their careers. Fought, and he had tremendous success other than the one blip, that he avenged. His whole career, other than that one fight, like he was successful until the very, very end when he was past his best. So the arguments for those two gentlemen are profound and they check a lot of boxes. But I think Langford should be considered in that discussion, although the texture of his career is a lot different than theirs. He checks a lot of boxes, including some that they don't, because of the size of his career. Now, he has about 314, give or take, known fights. Depends on sources. Some of the people that research think that it's possible certain fight results were duplicates, like where they misprinted or just had the bad information about the date at the time. Sometimes I've seen that in the papers. Once in a while, you see a fight reported for a certain day, but it actually, in all the other sources, is reported on a different day. It's the results, it's not the internet age then, so newspaper results, sometimes there was a lag of one day and sometimes they failed to adjust for that one day when they relayed the report or something to that effect. So he has about 314 no fights. Goodness knows how many other fights that just people haven't dug up or that just weren't recorded in the papers. But just going on that, now Langford's career spanned, as a professional, spanned, from like 135 pounds all the way up to basically open weight. And so filtering out all of that to try and figure out who he was as a heavyweight can be a little bit difficult. Certainly not as easy as, the eras that Louis and especially Ali, dominated. Langford's era was very complicated, and he never received an establishment heavyweight title shot. He fought the future establishment champion, Jack Johnson, in 1906. But that was before Johnson got a shot. Johnson actually took the belt, the world title, quote unquote world title. He was already the colored heavyweight champion for years, but he took the world title in 1908. Langford was supposed to be his first title defense contractually. He didn't end up doing it. The money was short. Once Jack Johnson, who'd been put off for years, once he got the world title, he behaved a lot differently. He went from fighting everyone and anyone to selecting opponents because he could make easier money fighting white hopes, because the public, a lot of the white public, were thirsting to see a white man avenge Jack Johnson's schooling of Tommy Burns, who was the champion before him. So Langford was put off for a world title shot, but because of the texture of Johnson's establishment title run, Langford ended up fighting all the top black contenders that Johnson should have been fighting, and then a whole bunch of other people beyond that. And his run was so miraculous, or not necessarily miraculous, but it was so heavy duty that, you know, when Joe Louis was the man, Langford was celebrated. He was long retired then, but he was celebrated as this mythical figure. And I think that's important to understand. You know, rating fighters is sometimes their memory dims a little bit over the generations. Even Joe Louis, compared to how he was seen at the time, isn't seen the same way today as he was even in the couple generations after him. That's just a natural thing to happen. Now, I mentioned that I had Langford top 3 on Twitter, and a guy I like to chat with on there, Rob, he just wondered about the criteria. So I'm going to do a longer version of this. This is just a short rambling. I've been up all night, but I just want to just maybe briefly touch on why he even qualifies. Part of it is the size of his heavyweight resume. He had over 150 fights at heavyweight, just at heavyweight. And among all the different great fighters who fought at heavyweight, he was the guy in the ring with the Hall of Fame level heavyweights. So if you strip away all the different careers, just look at the guys who are sort of enshrined in the Hall of Fame. There are some guys who should be in there who aren't. But even just look at the guys who have made it in so far, because that's an evolving thing, the Hall of Fame. They're inducting new people. But there are a lot of people in line to get in. But so I guess the best way to sum this up is, so I'm going to use a slide here, a couple slides from the Boxing Librarian from Hardline Boxing Talk. That's the channel name. They're permissible under fair use, but I actually have his permission to use slides from his videos. So it's like the last slide. The Boxing Librarian goes 20 fights at a time through careers and shows like rated champ, Hall of Fame opponents and things like that. This is a great resource. Go check out that channel, Hardline Boxing Talk. But this is the end of Joe Louis's career, so you can see he closes out with a great overall record, hugely impressive. And you can see as he goes out, he's fighting a lot of rated guys. So in his last, his last 9 fights, 8 of them were at least rated top 10 in their careers. You can see when you go down to his career results against men who were champions, who were world champions, 10-3. His record against Hall of Famers is the same, 10-3. Sometimes people are in the Hall, but they were never a champ, and some champs never make it into the Hall. So those numbers aren't always the same fighter to fighter. But that's a good record against Hall of Famers, 10-3. There are some great fighters who have even records against fellow Hall of Famers. So, but that's a remarkable 45-3 against men who are rated top 10 in their careers, and against top 3 fighters, 25-3 against guys who were at some point were a top 3 contender in the bracket, which is pretty incredible. If we switch over to Ali, now at the end of his slide, you can see all the notable opponents there. I mean, Ali is celebrated for good reason. He just kept fighting a who's who across 2 decades of a rich era. But he has you can see there at the bottom of the screen, it's a little small on my phone. You can see there, great record against champs, great record against Hall of Famers, fantastic record against both rated fighters and also against men who were top 3 in their careers. Now, Langford competed in the pre-ratings era, so it's a little tough to do this kind of breakdown. You can't really go and say this guy was a top 10, this guy was a top 10. They just didn't have it. So how do we interpret his career? Well, part of it is the reason these men made the top 10 at the time, at the various times they did, was because they did enough work to be among the best at, at the close of the year of a year. And we can sort of guesstimate some of that with some of Langford's opponents, that at least during one year they might have, peaked their way in the top 10. But there are certain opponents, great opponents, that Langford fought a bunch of times that were inarguably among the very best. Like they would have been top three, and made a powerful top three argument. Not just like everyone had a few fights, so they had a few better fights. The kind of pace of the schedules in this era, and how epic some of the fights could be. Like two of Langford's primary like notable opponents are themselves among my all-time great heavyweights by my measure. Great Joe Jeanette on the left there, and Sam McVeigh on the right. Jeanette was like a stamina machine, very clever fighter, fantastic jab, very good movement, but he was very resilient. He could take incredible damage. McVeigh on the right there was crafty, could fight going forwards or backwards, had knockout power, but he was also able to fight on the retreat. And that's actually what he adopted to be competitive with Langford, because although Sam Langford was a small person as far as his height and maybe his overall weight compared to the heavyweights, he hit harder than all of them, even the big guys. So to get the best of him, you couldn't just wade in. If you just waded in, the people who did that, Sam Langford in his prime, they just lost, and they usually got knocked out. You couldn't just stand toe-to-toe with the guy. But their longest fight between Jeanette and McVeigh was 49 rounds. That's over 2 hours of fighting. They fought that in Paris in 1909. That was only one of 3 fights they had that year. They fought for 20 rounds earlier in the year, and they fought for 30 rounds later in the year. 99 rounds against each other. So when I talk about great opponents of Sam Langford's, these are 2 of the main ones. They're not the only ones. These are 2 of the main ones. And he fought, between the pair of them, he had 29 fights against these 2 guys combined, which is crazy. So if we think back to, that's just 2 all-time great heavyweights. So that would be like if someone took the position that Ali's greatest opponents were George Foreman and Joe Frazier. Imagine he had 14 fights against George Foreman from all across their career, and then had 15 fights against Joe Frazier across the length of their careers, plus hundreds of other fights. That's sort of like the magnitude of Langford's CV. He didn't just fight great fighters a few times or even trilogies. I don't even know what the term would be for 14 of something. I should Google that if they have it. And so, Langford, all 3 of these guys fought great fighters, and in their own way they make an argument. But a lot of other great heavyweights don't check as many boxes as these 3. And even though Langford doesn't have the establishment title credentials, he was the colored heavyweight champion, which was a real championship. Is what Jack Johnson held in the years preceding his shot against Tommy Burns. And so Langford was like the king of people who were shut out of, during his era, the king of the people who were shut out of an establishment title shot. Himself, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh especially, and then later on the great Harry Wills, who Langford fought a whole slew of times, even more times than he had fought either of his other 2 great rivals. Hold on, we got someone in the chat. Scrap, hello, good sir. If you'd like, good morning to you. If you'd like to jump on and add some thoughts on this, feel free. I'll throw the link in the comments. Just say the word, sir. No pressure. I just had a short Twitter exchange. I just felt like expressing some stuff, because Langford's career, as you know, Scrap, is pretty difficult to sort of puzzle out at a casual glance. It's really a deep dive kind of career. Some careers are like that. Other ones you can sum up in some stats. But with Langford, other than maybe quoting that he's among the best knockout artists, he has some of the best knockout numbers in history, and certain other things like the most fights against Hall of Famers, the second most wins against Hall of Famers. And there are stats you can quote for him, but even that doesn't really tell the tale, because, as you know, there are tons of people that should be in the Hall of Fame, especially in Langford's opponents, who aren't there yet, like Jeff Clark, Dave Hawley. Oh, that's funny. Well, good morning to you. Hopefully, you tell me if I'm just talking too manically here. I'm just trying to be a little chill. I've been up all night working, but I've been waiting all night to come on and just jump on and have a little talk about Sam Langford. It's always a good time to talk about these great fighters. So have a nice coffee. Let me take a sip of my coffee, and I'm going to go off a little bit on the Boston Bone Crusher. So I don't have all my slides pulled up, but I'm gonna just gonna pull up a couple to illustrate a point, because there have been lots of great fighters throughout history. Langford is absolutely one of them. A lot of people struggle to know where, like which bracket to even rate him in. So they say, well, he was a middleweight, but he was already fighting light heavyweights. Light heavyweight didn't always have prestige in his time. It had some before his time, but during his early years, it actually lost prestige and then later picked up and became a great division with a storied history. But you know, but when Langford was a middle, welterweight, he was fighting much larger guys. But then when he was up at middleweight, he's fighting larger guys. So he was building a heavyweight resume when he could still fight, and did fight at the lower brackets, in the lower divisions. Nick, what's up, sir? Good morning. If you're in the U.S. or in these time zones, good morning. Just having a little bit of coffee and a little talk about Sam Langford. I'm going to pull up some graphics. So to further illustrate the point I was making about Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, and Sam Langford, like they weren't just contenders to Jack Johnson. They were far more than that. This is their combined 1911. So this is a listing of the fights just those three fighters participated in 1 year. From the sources I've looked at, that's 1 year of work for three guys. And if you think about today's boxing, some great boxers, they put on some big fights, people are making lots of money. But how many of the, do the top 10 boxers at heavyweight have as many fights as these three men had in 1 year? Like the champion and the top 10 consensus. I don't even know if they do. That's a lot of fights. But that's just 1 year of their careers. So this is how, yes, Nick says he has Sam as his number 3 heavyweight of all time. Yeah, I agree with that. I have Sam comfortably inside 3, but I'm just not sure where, because the arguments for Lewis and Ali are fantastic. Lewis had that incredible success against the best, and even ignoring like the cultural reasons and other reasons where people would attach greatness to that aspect, but just strictly in fighting, Joe Louis had remarkable success. He didn't recapture the belts a bunch of times like other fighters have, which is another way of bouncing back from losses is another way to prove greatness. He didn't do that because he didn't lose. He just kept it, and then when he was past his prime, he lost it, and he tried to come back, but then it was past his time. Whereas Ali was able to recapture, for different reasons, recapture that belt and prove his greatness in that aspect. Both of them have phenomenal win-loss records. You're in England, Nick. I'm in England, buddy. Just had surgery, so whacked out on codeine. I'm trying to stay awake. Oh, brother. Oh, well, I hope you're feeling okay. If you want to jump on the chat, I don't think codeine would ruin your ability to just chat a little boxing, but it's nice to have you here. It's a pleasure seeing you. I'm just kind of doing this on impulse, but because I have these slides loaded in, I'm about to revamp them for a thing. I want to make a small announcement while I have you here. So Scrapbook, Boxing Librarian, and myself, we're going to rank top 10. It seems like our next project is going to be the top 10 middleweights of all time. This is very intense research needed, but I'm looking forward to this, and I'm working on the graphics already. So we're going to actually do another live stream. It's probably going to be a good 2 or 3 hour long live stream some point in the next several weeks. I'm not sure when, but I'm really looking forward to that. But aside from that, I have some other projects coming up. numerous ones, and I'll do an announcement video to get into those. Just going to touch a little bit more on Langford here. So the graphic I have up on the screen shows the kind of work in a lot of years. And those, each of these three fighters at this time, Langford, Jeanette, McVeigh, they all had severe winning records. It wasn't like they were, if you look on the screen, on the left side of each listing, it's pretty much one of the three in the winning column. You know, they fought each other several times, so no one went, no one gets them all when you keep fighting each other at the top level. Someone's got to lose if you don't draw. So we check the comments here. That's worthy of throwing up on the screen. Yes, sir, Nick. I am absolutely pumped to see any enthusiasm for those talks, because they're a dream come true for me. I really love these. And I'm way in over my head, so it's a challenge. There's an excitement about trying to avoid being wrong or having unfounded opinions. I've spent a lot of time studying boxing over the last several years, but there's so much to learn. I'm still a rookie. I still feel like a rookie. So another thing with Langford is, so like, he has massive Hall of Fame numbers. Not all of them were in their primes, just like many other fighters. If you look at all their Hall of Fame opponents, like Marciano stopped Joe Louis, right? That was old Joe Louis. That was still a world-class win, but it wasn't the same as if he had gotten prime Joe Louis. It just wasn't. Langford had examples of that. So it's not like I'm trying to take an untenable position of like all he ever did was beat prime killers in their prime who were bigger than him. He did a lot of that. But he also, like this, that's Philadelphia Jack O'Brien on the left there, one of the great middleweight / light heavyweights of the early era, and consequentially of all time. But he's not often mentioned, but his year-to-year schedule was insane, and he was a huge star. And he fought a lot of fights, 6-round fights. So perhaps that's why he's not remembered as much as others. He was more of a shorter fight guy, but he fought a who's who with a ridiculous record. And Langford fought him in 1911. That was several years past the end of his prime, and Langford smashed him around. He was even larger than him. That was one of the fights he had a size advantage in. So that fight wasn't competitive at all from the reports I read. And that would count as one of his Hall of Fame wins, his many Hall of Fame wins. But wouldn't be the same as, say, the times he was getting the best of the Oxnard Cyclone, Sam McVeigh, who was between 200 and 220 pounds in his career. It was like a career heavyweight. Langford was a little guy, and a lot of times when they fought, McVeigh might have 20 or 30 pounds on him. And McVeigh was a knockout puncher who could also fight on the retreat, like I mentioned earlier. So Langford was the kind of adversity he was overcoming. And then Langford also fought guys who were not in the Hall of Fame, but who had even more size on him than the dozens of pounds McVeigh did. For example, battling Jim Johnson. Battling Jim Johnson was enormous. He wasn't like Fury, like towering high, but he would come in, 230, 240, no problem. And he's a muscular guy. He wasn't like a flabby 230, 240. I think he was about 6'3", and he was a very aggressive fighter. Now, normally, if you give someone enough size, Langford, some of the times they fought him, he might have had 60 pounds or more on him. If you give someone enough size, even if they aren't as good a fighter, they can often just bully the smaller fighter around, especially in like a rough era with smaller gloves. But battling Jim, to my understanding, I don't think he actually ever got a win over Langford, although they did draw at times. And he was fighting with a ridiculous size. And after a few fights, he's now familiar with Langford, so he should be able to exploit that. But Langford was really that good that even a big guy, it's like if you take Canelo, right? We'll have Canelo fight like Andy Ruiz or Usyk or someone, or even like a heavyweight fighter further down the chain. You give him 50 or 60 pounds over a guy who isn't himself a heavyweight, who doesn't have that stopping power. That can be a rough night. It's a very special fighter who can overcome that. Oh, Nick says, oh, my uploaded pictures. You mean the videos, the Name That Boxer series? Yeah, I'm going to try and do some more. I'm trying to remember if I had Jack O'Brien in there. I'm not sure if I did. Oh, the guy with the chin? That was Gunboat Smith. That was a close-up of Gunboat Smith. I think that's who you mean. Yeah, good call on spotting the chin. That was a different epic chin. Physically, literally epic chin. Yeah, I'm gonna do some more of those. I'm trying to think of a format if there's a way, because I don't want to give the answers away in the comments, but then when people guess them, I got to do it. I guess I just got to keep putting some up. So Langford fought that. So like Langford's able to get the best of not only guys like Battling Jim who have huge size and they're just bigger people, bigger heads, bigger fists, and very aggressive, but someone like McVeigh who was a comedy, he could knock people out, but he could also fight very craftily, especially on the retreat with jabs and lead hooks. And Langford had more success than failures or draws against McVeigh. But McVeigh, if you look at his record against other people, he was a knockout machine. And McVeigh either stopped quicker or stopped where Langford hadn't stopped other heavyweight opponents. They had a lot of common opponents, all these great fighters in this era. And so McVeigh, when Langford had his collisions with McVeigh, they both had tremendous success. But in some of the results, McVeigh actually improved on Langford's results. So styles definitely make fights, just because, one thing happens. And then when they fought each other, how they did against other opponents didn't really inform their own fights, their own epic long series against each other. Nick, Gumbo Smith, the square jaw. Yeah, that was a bit of a trick one too, because I think it's a slightly older photo of Gumbo Smith. But yeah, I had to throw in some tricky. I had to make it tough because I know you guys know these pictures. So if I like the pictures, if I have them like this right here, even if the screen's red to obscure it a little bit, it's still pretty obvious, So I had to do a little zooming and panning. Oh, thanks, Scrap, for the compliment. Yeah, I love some of these photos, especially loved seeing them in suits. These weren't cavemen. This wasn't that long ago. When these fights are happening, it feels like a long time. It's more than a human lifetime, but it wasn't that long ago, historically speaking. We have video of some of these things. Not their fights between each other, not McVeigh and Langford specifically. But we have video of stuff from back then. That is recent history on the scale of things. Like I'm back at like 150 BC in the Roman history that I've been studying lately as just a hobby, a side hobby. That's old. You go back thousands of years, it's a long time. 100 years and change, it's nothing. So I like seeing these fighters in suits and dressed up so people can get, like, these were respectable people living a good life in relatively modern times. They're the four greatest heavyweights of the first half of Langford's career, because then once Harry Wills came in and then later Jack Dempsey and other guys came in, but the first half of Langford's career, Jack Johnson, Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, there they are like bosses. Johnson fought all of them, but once Johnson won the world title, the establishment title, and then vacated the colored title, they all fought amongst it, and then Johnson fought a bunch of white dudes plus Battling Jim Johnson. He gave him a title shot. I think they fought in Paris. Johnson was having some legal difficulties, and also Johnson had gotten screwed himself for years, so he kind of did what had been done to him. It wasn't unprecedented what Johnson was doing, taking somewhat easier fights and ducking the top guys maybe a little bit. Oh, that's interesting. You said it's the Romans that brought boxing to the UK. That's very cool. That's very cool indeed. So I haven't dropped really too much in the way of stats or anything like that. But I think there's a. I guess I should talk about common. No, actually, you know what? I don't want to get too garbled here. So here's the great Jack Johnson. So he was the man, right? He was the colored champ. He was, from what boxing librarian Scrapbook have said, he was undefeated in colored championship title fights. He made an undefeated run as the champion. He had lost prior to that, but he made an undefeated run as the colored champion, basically fighting a bunch of guys who were getting screwed for world title shots themselves, even when they were more worthy. It was just racial politics of the day. But then he did get to fight Australian promoter Hugh McIntosh, put up enough money, 30,000, I believe, that Tommy Burns, the world champ, who was a Canadian of Italian heritage, Noah Brusso is his real name, gave Jack Johnson a shot. Johnson borrowed money with the promise that he would defend against Langford if he won. He didn't end up doing that, but he did go and beat Tommy Burns soundly. in Australia and took the world title. And then he was fighting good fighters and a couple of great fighters, but he then largely ignored his fellow colored fighters who then were contesting for the belt that he had held. So it's Jack Johnson is incredibly great. I have him inside top 10 all time, along with Jeanette, McVeigh, Langford, and Harry Wills. I have all of them inside the top 10. And, you know, Johnson's career was a little shorter than the others, but it's just packed with a who's who. Even, you know, even his world championship reign, the establishment title, he still had a good level of competition. He wasn't fighting scrubs. He just wasn't necessarily fighting all the top contenders. We see that today. See guys who fight, they may not want to fight the top 3 or 4. They'll fight someone else. And then people go, oh, that's a good fight. I'll watch that. Yeah, thanks, Scrap. Yeah, undefeated as champion until Jess Willard in 1915. You know, I can't remember what year it was that Johnson, was it 1903? He won. Scrap, was it 1903 he won the colored heavyweight championship? Just one loss as champion. Yeah, Jack Johnson's an incredible fighter. And so the story of Sam Langford was sort of that he was the top contender at a time when Johnson wasn't going to fight the great black fighters. And then Johnson's successor, Jess Willard, wasn't going to fight the great black fighters. And then Willard's successor, Jack Dempsey, wasn't going to fight the great black fighters. So, but, oh, thanks, Scrap. Yeah, I appreciate it. I thought it was 1903. Because I think Denver Ed Martin, didn't he win it in 1902? And then in 03, Johnson beat him for it. I need to go and listen. You've talked a lot about this, and I need to brush up on, there's a book I'm going to order eventually. Denver Ed Martin, 20 rounds. Powerful fighter, Denver Ed Martin. And BL did a great video on him. I did the career video on him. I love those pre-ratings era videos from BL. Those videos, Scrap, and your talks about the early era, that's just my favorite content on YouTube. I can listen to you guys all day. And sometimes I do. So Jack Johnson had tremendous success. Nothing I say about Langford being ducked or anything is to try and take away from Jack Johnson, because what he did more than most heavyweights get to do before he got a world title shot. When he was a colored champ, he had a fantastic run. So the sum of his whole career is epic and all-time great, even though when Sam Langford hit his prime, he wouldn't fight him and turned down some good money. There were times when the best money he could make was against Sam Langford, and several promoters came up with that money, and he just either raised the stakes or kind of dropped it. He wasn't going to, he fought other guys instead. But we see that today. You know, we see Fury, he's expressing no interest in fighting the Usyk Joshua winner, but he's saying, and you know, he's talking about he was undisputed when we know he wasn't. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, Wilder held the, hello, welcome to the chat. Oh, that's nice. Is that who's that in your thumbnail? That's a nice one. I broke my train of thought. It's so small on my screen. I'm trying to see who that is. Is that Marciano hitting Ezra Charles with an uppercut? Aliu? It's so small on my screen, but that looks like how Rocky used to. It's only like 5 millimeters across, but it looks like how Rocky used to throw those all-in uppercuts. Love it. Yeah, so just for you joining us now, I'm just talking a little bit about the great Sam Langford, Canadian-born Boston bone crusher, and his great career and why I have him. Oh, nice. It is Rocky. Yeah, because I feel like I've seen that photo, but that's how Rocky used to throw those all in. Gavilan Robinson, that's another great uppercut. I've seen that one too. So welcome. This is just, I'm not getting into anything heavy. I'm just touching on Langford's career. I'm going to upload a new realm of slides and things like that. But while I talk for a second, let me throw up a video I did. I've used this before, but here's just a little bit of footage and pictures of Langford. There he is, 5'7.5". Look at that. Power puncher. Left hook is his best punch. Right straight was his other one. Langford was thick. That's him with Big Bill Tate there on the left. That flashed up on the screen. There's Langford doing his little thing. Look how long his arms are. 5'7.5" tall, 6'2" wingspan. And considered the hardest puncher of his era, even when he was only like 175 pounds, and there were guys competing who were well over 200, 220, 240. Not a bunch of guys over 240, but there were guys over 240 and above. in that era, and he was considered the hardest puncher of his era, as Bob Fitzsimmons had been considered in the era prior. And Bob Fitzsimmons was even smaller than Langford, but its punching power is technique. It's not hitting a machine. It's landing at an angle with precision, speed, and timing on somebody to deliver pounds per square inch to the vital parts to produce a knockout. You know, it's not punching a wall with sensors in it, because then you could talk about guys like Foreman who split heavy bags, or even like Primo Carnero, who's like a gigantic man with a huge barrel chest. You could fit a couple of guys inside his frame. Or George Godfrey, the Libreville Shadow, another giant of a man, or Ernie Shavers. You could even maybe get, if you just had a machine, maybe Wilder, if you didn't have him falling off balance and people capitalizing, maybe he would score high. But that's different from Joe Louis, Sam Langford. These guys were precision killers. And so they weren't just knocking people out because they were huge and could deliver just thudding power. This was a lot of technique, and Langford had all the technique. He learned from great fighters. Ruby Robb. That's right, Nick. Yeah, Ruby Robb could really hit. And this was an era when lots of guys could really hit. So it wasn't like he was, the strength of an era has a lot to do with how a lot of people who are historical enthusiasts rate somebody. So like Joe Louis, his title record is insane, right? And he was the heavyweight champion. He wasn't like one of several guys. He was the champion. He went on tours to other people's cities to go beat their ass in their own city. Like, he was a serious guy, right? But maybe not the strongest era. So even though he had that insanely long reign, that doesn't automatically mean that everyone rates him the greatest of all time. Because then you have like Muhammad Ali, who a lot of people would feel probably fought in a richer era. And he certainly fought most of the best across 2 whole decades across that rich era. So he almost fought the vast majority of the best across 2 eras. But certainly, if you count Ali's career, so like the argument for him, even ignoring all the social aspects, the other forms of greatness that people attach to athletes, but just fighting, just competition greatness, Ali and Joe Louis make a very strong case. But Langford's, although it's a lot different, is incredibly strong of its own merit, just in a different way. But the main one I would say is for his prime years, because the great Harry Wills, the Brown Panther, who was ducked fiercely by Jack Dempsey, ducked to where Dempsey embarrassed himself to avoid the fight with Harry Wills and went against public opinion to not have that fight. So, who knows how much even bigger his legacy could have been if he was, if the champions had been busier. But for the Langford's prime, these were his main rivals, because he fought Jack Johnson before his prime. Johnson won. Johnson wouldn't fight him again, and they never fought again. But these guys here, he had 14 and 15 fights against these two. So, and they are 2 immeasurably great heavyweights who didn't just, it wasn't like they were beating nobodies and then just fighting each other. They were beating powerful fighters, all 3 of them, at a crazy schedule and fighting each other. And so, Langford had fight series that go beyond, Ali Frazier, the 3 fights, or go beyond, any of the guys who are having rematches and stuff like that. They didn't do it. They didn't have 14 or 15 fights against their greatest opponents. And so Langford's argument, a lot of that hinges on the fact of how much work he did against fighters who proved Nick Harmer, Joe Louis, number 1. That's absolutely fair. I mean, what an incredible fighter. I comfortably have Louis, Ali, and Langford as my top 3, just from what I know so far. Yep, Nick also has Joe Louis. Yeah, there's a superb argument for him as number 1. I struggle to put them in order because Langford has had less uninterrupted success, but he had just a much larger career at the highest levels. So, win-loss ratio is important, but there are usually some other factors. Like Langford, I think he has like something like, if you include newspaper decisions, which were fights that went the distance in states that forbade a decision being rendered if there was no finish in the fight. They'd have a real fight. They'd be trying to finish so they could get that KO on their record, but there was no finish. They wouldn't allow it. And then the newspaper men who attended, who were very adversarial and very harsh on the boxers, they would score the fight. It was much more honest in those days. There's a lot more spam these days. So they would score the fight. And that's how and then you take that like a panel of judges. So that's how we judge newspaper decisions. But if you count those, Langford, I think he has just over 40 losses. But I think I counted one day, and 23 of those losses came after he lost sight in one eye. So right there, out of his losses, you can cut those in half if you're just talking about Sam Langford fighting with two good eyes. Fred Fulton, a very large heavyweight, mushed his eye up with jabs in 1917 when Langford was getting a little bit past his prime. That pretty much put him fully past his prime, was he could only see out of one eye. But he still fought a crazy schedule. He still kept a winning record. Even when he started to go blind in the other eye, he still kept a winning record or an even record year to year. It's really crazy how good he was. And his physical condition deteriorating did not make him not a threat. He had great wins when he had no one would have any business having great wins, and Langford still had some. Some guys, Sam Langford and Harry Greb, they did a lot of work with one eye. On top of all the other great things they did, they had that extra adversity of, okay, now you're a Cyclops. Now you have no depth perception. Good luck with that. But Langford could make it work because he's one of the hardest hitters in history. And when Joe Louis was the man, generations later, when Joe Louis was the top dog, it was Sam Langford they compared him to. It wasn't the big guys. It wasn't Johnson. It was Sam Langford's punching power, because Joe Louis was just sparking people. Ferocious punching power. But it was little Sam Langford, little Sammy, that they were saying, does Joe Louis punch as hard as Sam Langford? And there was questions about that. And that's including questions from Jack Blackburn, who fought Sam Langford multiple times. And apparently he thought that Langford would have beaten Joe Louis. He thought Louis would have beaten Jack Johnson. This from a live chat BL did, the boxing librarian did, where he was relaying that. But also there's a lot of people, in a lot of people's estimation, Joe Louis was the inheritor of the greatness of Sam Langford. He was on that level. That was the ultimate compliment you could give a dominant heavyweight, is he like on a Sam Langford level? So that should tell you a lot, because, hold on, let's see here. Aliu has your top three heavies: Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, Jack Dempsey. Those are great fighters. Those are all great fighters. There are arguments for so many. Scrapbook says, oh yeah, 1938, yeah, the fight with Schmel, the most important fight probably in prize fighting history. There's actually like global political implications. Yeah, I think, and when we talk about pressure, you talk about pressure of the world on the man, and he just came through. Boy, did he come through. Yeah, Joe Louis, what an incredible fighter. And I wouldn't, there are a lot of heavyweights. People want to say they're the greatest. That's cool. I definitely wanted to come on and make a case for Langford at least being in the conversation, especially as all the fights he had against truly great, all-time great stylists that don't come around that often. There are fighters who put together phenomenal records. That goes all the way back. You can go back to the 1800s and see guys with huge win columns and very few or no losses. But once they start mixing in that top company, people pick up losses. That was true of Langford. And, but part of that was because he often gave up size. So if he had just fought men his own size, he would have probably put on some insane win streaks. But he was often trying to overcome a lot of adversity. And so he didn't go undefeated, but he went on some serious runs. Like after he lost to Jack Johnson in 1906, giving up probably 30 pounds or more to the great Jack Johnson in a colored heavyweight title fight. He lost to him, and then he lost to a very hard punching, I think he was like welter and middleweight, young Peter Jackson, Sim Tompkins, fantastic fighter, real puncher. He actually lost to him right after he lost to Johnson. He took about 5 months off. When he came back November 1906, I'm pretty sure it was about 30, I think it was 35 fights unbeaten. He had some draws in there, but he didn't lose a fight for 35 fights over the next few years, until who was it who snapped the streak? Fireman Jim Flynn edged him, and then which he avenged 5 weeks later with I think an 8th round KO, a devastating KO. But I think I was part of like a 21 fight unbeaten streak, and then he lost to, I believe it was Sam McVeigh. Then he went on another streak. You know what I mean? So even though he was picking up losses, he was putting in career-sized win streaks, if you talk in modern terms, along the way. Yeah, on the Joe Louis Schmeling fight, absolutely global implications. What an outcome! Yeah, that's a great point, Scrap. World symbol of what heavyweight champion is about. Yeah, he came through. He overcame some of the most insane adversity, not just fighting top fighters. Because Joe Louis, you know, like people say he didn't fight anyone. That's a little bit unfair. That's actually dramatically unfair to his legacy. Joe Louis fought plenty of someone's. You know, because you don't end up with 45 wins over rated fighters. 45 and 3, it looks like, right? Shout out to the boxing librarian for his excellent graphics, and thanks to him for the permission to use the slides on occasion in my videos. But 25-3 against top 3 fighters. And I think about, this isn't to diss Tyson Fury, but think about what Fury's talking about, or the fans are talking about, like how great he is. Yeah, he's great. One of the best of the modern era. It would be nice to see him try to become undisputed and prove himself the best of his era, I should say, not the modern era, but his section of the modern era. But he doesn't have 25 wins against guys who are top 3 heavyweights. I don't even know how many he has. Maybe one of you guys who follows the heavyweight texture of today more could let me know how many. Like, and he certainly doesn't have 45 wins over opponents who were top 10 in their careers. You know, so we're talking about Joe Louis. We're not talking about someone you could compare today's boxers to necessarily in any favorable way, which is why a lot of people have him number one, like the kind of numbers he put up, the dominance he showed. Ali had a ridiculous career in a very rich era, you know, quite probably richer than Joe Louis' era. And so, you know, he's righteously put high. But Langford, you know, like the single to me in the scrap, me, you, and BL all agreed on this. The single toughest year that I've ever seen in a boxer's career, not the busiest, but the toughest, Sam Langford's 1916. This is just 1 year of his career. He had lots of years where he fought more than one fight against Hall of Famers, but look at this. He fights the great Harry Wills, loses over 20 rounds on points, right? And that's in January. But by the end of February, he's had 4 more fights. So in those first 2 months of the year, you know, he loses to Wills over 20 rounds, but then he knocks out Andrew Johnson 4 rounds. Then he knocks out the great Harry Wills in 19 rounds. He went through hell in that fight, but he got the finish. He was deadly in the 19th round. Wills was one of the many, many great fighters who celebrated the punching power of Sam Langford. And Wills should know, because he fought a who's who, and he was an incredible puncher himself. Part of the reason he became so is he fought guys like Langford. But then, so that's February 11th, knocks out Harry Wills, 19 rounds, goes through a lot. But then February 17th, he's back in the ring. He fights 10 rounds in a no-decision state against Sam McVeigh in New York. So it goes the distance, but the newspapermen, the majority of them, deemed him to have gotten the best of it. So he got a win over Sam McVeigh, another all-time great heavyweight. And then gets a newspaper decision over Cleve Hawkins. I'm not familiar with him. I guess a New York area heavyweight. So just January and February, he's had 3 fights against Hall of Fame heavyweights, against all-time great, across all generations, all-time great heavyweights. That's just 2 months' work, plus 2 other wins. Then in March, he's back in with Harry Wills. He loses a newspaper decision over 10 rounds. Then he knocks out this guy, Dave Mills, in Syracuse, New York, 2 rounds. Then he knocks out the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark. Jeff Clark is someone who should probably be in the Hall of Fame. And like I mentioned before, there are guys from the old school who deserve Hall of Fame honors, just don't have it. So Langford's Hall of Fame numbers are ridiculous. They could be even more ridiculous. You put Jeff Clark in there, he had a bunch of fights against Jeff Clark. There are other guys like Dave Hawley. He had a lot of fights against Hawley. Jack Blackburn, young Peter Jackson, they should both be in the Hall as fighters. Blackburn's in as a coach, but that's not the same. He should be in there as a fighter. So that's in March. So he's knocked out the great jabber mover Jeff Clark as part of their long fight series, KO in 5. Then he fights Sam McVeigh again. He's not even done with the heavyweight Hall of Famers. All 1 year, folks. In April, he fights 2 fights against Hall of Fame of all-time great heavyweights just in April. Sam McVeigh, 10 rounds, no decision state in Philly, in Philadelphia. Then loses over 8 rounds, no decision in St. Louis to the great Harry Wills again. All right, fine. Next month, May 2nd, back in there with Sam McVeigh, 12 rounds to a draw with the much larger, power-punching, adaptable Oxnard Cyclone Sam McVeigh. Now it's Joe Jeanette's turn, May 12th. So he fought on the 2nd. Yeah, but 10 days later, he knocks out the great Joe Jeanette. And he was even surprised he knocked out Jeanette, because Jeanette is one of the hardest people to finish in history. And famously so, in a division full of badasses in a rich era, Jeanette was famously difficult to finish and so resilient. And he was always wanting to fight long fights against people. Not everyone would book those. And if you need an example why, it's the aforementioned 49-round fight to the finish against Sam McVeigh. Jeanette was smaller than McVeigh. He lasted through hell, bunch of knockdowns, won the fight. McVeigh had to relent before the 50th round. The 50th 3-minute round. They went through 49 of them. So he actually finishes Joe Jeanette, which is one of the highlights of it. One of the greatest things he did was finish Joe Jeanette, because that was one of the hardest things to do in this incredible era. But he's not done with McVeigh, so now he's going to fight in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Fights to a draw over 20 rounds with Sam McVeigh. This is all still just 1 year. This is like a whole career's worth of tough fights for a great fighter, and far more than just a good or very good or just generic champion level fighter would do in their whole career. He's fighting all these Hall of Fame fights. I don't know if Fury has even fought that many fights against guys who were top 3 in their division at heavyweight at some point in their career, let alone these guys who are like all-time greats. So then August, he takes September off. At the end of November, he fights in Syracuse, another New York's no decision state at this time, 10 rounds against Big Bill Tate, sparring partner for a lot of people, including, I believe, Jack Dempsey. Big Bill Tate was big. He was seriously big. And he wins in the newspaper men's eyes, harsh eyes, I should mention. He wins. Then he fights Battling Jim Johnson, an enormous man, and he knocks out Battling Jim Johnson in the 12th round. He's knocking out guys he shouldn't be knocking out as a little dude. He was a little bit heavy by this time, by his standards, but he might have just been 180 something, so like he weighed like Rocky, except he was shorter than Rocky. Much longer arms, but much shorter in height. Then some guy, Bob DeVere, I'm not familiar with, he fights him up in Canada, so probably just a Canadian heavyweight, but gets the best of him over 10 rounds. Again, it's newspaper. That's just 1 year. Langford had 314 fights, but that's his toughest year right there. He had more wins in other years, but that is a ridiculous single year of fighting. Stuff like this is why it's hard to get through a career this big without knowing who everyone is. I don't know all these opponents. I'm not familiar with DeVere and Andrew Johnson, Cleve Hawkins. I don't know, and Dave Mills. I don't know those guys. All those other guys are badass guys. Less so Big Bill Tate battling Jim Johnson. They were matched tough, but they weren't as successful. McVeigh, Jeanette, and Wills and Jeff Clark are all incredible fighters and stylistically challenging for a little short guy. Even if he has some of the hardest punches in history, some of the best technique in history, and some of the most experience in history, still tough fights for him. So to keep a winning record with that kind of year. Let's see. Let me just jump to the comments here real quick. Joe Lewis KO. Everyone he defended against that one is crazy. Over 25 defend. Yeah, that's Nick. That's one of the reasons. Like, can't say enough good things about Joe Lewis, because he wasn't just, he was knocking people dead. Like he was famously a hard hitter for great reason. Could be really been a fan of a boxer back then when they're fighting so frequently. That's right, Nick. You didn't have to. You could pick a couple guys, or maybe even one guy in a weight class. I imagine people would do that, and then that was their guy, and they would fight enough that that would sustain them. Whereas today, you kind of got to just take what you get from everybody collectively. And like I've said on other streams, I'm a huge mixed martial arts fan, or the one of the leagues, Bellator, because it runs as a league sport currently. It shouldn't, but it does. But it's frustrating because guys fight two, and if they fight 3 or 4 fights in just 1 year, that's considered busy. But no one's doing this. Look at this. Sam Langford's 1916 is crazy. I want to pull some stuff up, though, to show that this isn't just 1 year. He wasn't just doing this. I won't go through the whole listing, but so to my understanding, his first fight at heavyweight, his first heavyweight opponent was Joe Jeanette in December of 1905. Langford was pretty young. This was the rest of his 1905. He was fighting up different weights. Dave Holly was a lightweight / welterweight. George Cole, I think, was a middleweight who fought up all the way up to heavyweight. I think George Gunther, I'm not sure if he was welter or middle. Young Peter Jackson, I think, was middleweight, welter and middle. Larry Temple, welterweight, I believe, who fought at higher weights. Jack Blackburn fought all the way up the weights. He was pretty much a welterweight by 1905. Larry Temple again, Blackburn, young Peter Jackson again, Jack Blackburn again. Then he fights Joe Jeanette. He loses that fight. And then in 1906, he beats Joe Jeanette, but he loses to Jack Johnson. But like, you jump forward in his career. I don't have every year pulled up in slides. I'm missing 1913, I'm afraid. But you see here in 1911, Joe Jeanette, he fights Bill Lang, who contended for the world title against Tommy Burns, and had lost to Jack Johnson. And Bill Lang was one of the contenders, but didn't manage to win the championship. Then he fights McVeigh, fights some other guys. Then he fights Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, the great middleweight / light heavyweight that I mentioned. Schools him. Tony Ross was about 220. He was a heavy guy. He knocks him out in this fight. And this might actually be the one where I saw a newspaper clipping where he knocked him out with a punch that traveled about 6 inches, which was something they used to say about Joe Louis. Like, he was very economical with his movement. That was part of his charm, was he could knock you out with either hand from short distances. And he learned that from Jack Blackburn. Jack Blackburn was a contemporary of Sam Langford. And so that old school technique, Joe Louis's success came from old school technique that had been sort of fit to the poured into the mold of Joe Louis's physical power and capabilities. But it was old school technique. He was a throwback of sorts, or an adaptation of a throwback. And later, some of the things that Joe Louis did, if you imagine a guy with really short arms trying to do them, you end up with Rocky Marciano. Shuffling in so that you're always ready to punch. You're never like not really crossing your legs much. You know, you're shuffling forward and you're keeping your head off to the side so you can move back a little bit. You can duck and move back to present a smaller target, but also to take the sting off punches. You can counter with hooks, uppercuts, and overhands and things like that. So Rocky Marciano is like a short-armed Joe Louis type fighter. He's just not seen that way because he didn't quite have as much balance, but Joe Louis had to learn that balance. Jack Blackburn helped him get that with that old school technique. So guy like Rocky, people would be like, oh, he's a punching machine. Yes, he was, but he had very excellent technique for his own particular physical attributes. And in a similar way, Sam Langford, with the long arms but being short, he developed from all his experience the perfect style to kick everybody's ass, or a lot of asses, with his physical capabilities: a giant chest, long arms, flat head, thick neck, but short. You know, thick thighs, but short. So he was a low target. And you can't assume that just because someone's tall, they're going to beat a shorter guy. I mean, even some like very popular, famously popular, look at Mike Tyson's career. If being short compared to your opponents was just, oh, you just can't do it. I mean, Tyson wouldn't have had a career. He was a small heavyweight. He wrecked guys because he had punching power and technique. Sam Langford had punching power and technique. There's a lineage of guys. Joe Louis had punching power and technique. Muhammad Ali, the great Muhammad Ali, didn't necessarily have one-shot punching power, but he was a finisher. If you look at his career, he finished a lot of guys. I mean, he finished Foreman. So it wasn't like he couldn't. And Archie Moore, great finisher, who fought up the weights, including heavyweight, but at light heavyweight, probably quite possibly top two all time light heavyweight, quite possibly the top one. There's arguments for different guys, but certainly Archie Moore. Not necessarily a one punch kill power, but combos and getting the guy the right moment. Ali was like that. If he unloaded on you, he could stop people without necessarily just punching you off your feet. But Langford and Joe Louis had that one punch KO power, and they put it to great effect. So that's just Langford's 1911. But in 1912, after the loss of McVeigh, he goes to Australia, and he gets the best of Jim Barry for 20 rounds. Then he draws with McVeigh, and then to close out the year, after he smashes Dan Porky Flynn in 14 rounds. But then, and apparently Dan Porky Flynn didn't get the nickname because he was fat. I guess that was his favorite food. But anyway, Sam McVeigh, 3 wins against Sam McVeigh, which is incredible. And those were big fights. The last one wasn't as hotly anticipated because they'd already fought a few times, but those were big fights. And so that's just one more year, just 1 year. Oh, it's just a little year having 4 fights against one of the greatest heavyweights ever, and then some other fights. Just ridiculous. I'm afraid I'm missing 1913. I'm gonna speed up now, so I'm getting tired. I've been awake for 1,000 years. But here's his 1914. I'm gonna leave it up on the screen while I just go take a peek at the comments. Yeah, Nick, I'm in the same boat, brother. Says I never stop being amazed when I look at Sam's resume. Yeah, it's just I typed it up. I made an Excel chart of his whole career according to BoxRec, and also just checking in on Cyber Boxing Zone just so I could just sit and look at it and just kind of try and soak it in. It's just too much. Well, that's an interesting comment. Ali was so great. Never. That's a good point. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think. Okay, I need to go rewatch Ali fights with that in mind. I guess he was so good with the jab and so mobile that he could headhunt because he was the faster guy. He was the guy with lightning hands, so he could just bap him in the head. I thought it was interesting, and I forget which one was one of the Liston fights where Liston gets really aggressive and he's able to land to the body on Ali and gives him a little bit of trouble briefly there before Ali recovers. But I do wonder about Ali fighting someone like Langford who hit really, really hard, and he was fast. He was part of his power was his speed and the fact that he was so strong, his frame, and he had that experience. But I would wonder about some of these great heavyweights, even the mobile ones. Oh, yes, sir, Nick. I do wonder because, even Ali, in a moment of candor, when he was talking about Rocky Marciano, who had really short arms. Langford didn't have short arms. He had respectable arms, I think 74 inches, but only 5'7" tall. But Ali, when he was being honest, wasn't even sure if Rocky would have beaten him or not. And Rocky was a smaller guy. Rocky's one of those guys people say he's too small to compete. Well, Ali proved he could beat some much larger asses than his own. But Rocky was a special guy, partly because of that punching power. Langford was that kind of fighter. Small doesn't matter if you can reach a guy, and Rocky had to get in close, but Langford didn't have to get in that close. He was short, but he had a big enough reach, and he loved to bang the body. He would pressure someone. If they led, he would attack their body. That's what he said. He would drive them toward the road. If they didn't respond, he would drive them out of the ring. But if they led, he would bang the body. And then he would use that to open up. He could feint with his right and then throw just this incredible left hook / shovel hook. He could work it different ways. He got a lot of knockouts that way. That was what he unloaded on his best opponents. Feint with the right and then hit him with everything with the left. And they already feared his body punching, so he could feint low with the right. He didn't have to feint like an overhand. So they were not only defending the center line instead of the left side of their head, but he could feint low because they had to respect his power of the body. Yes, sir, Nick, you got it, brother. Yeah, Cyber Boxing Zone I love that site. It doesn't have records for everyone like BoxRec, but it does. The people it does have them for, they also have write-ups. They have references to books on them. That's a fantastic site. And I usually go and look there because they also list exhibitions. So some of these old school fighters, they may not have had professional bouts as much as others. But then if you count their exhibitions, they were doing like theater tours or they were doing sparring exhibitions. They were some of these guys were extremely busy being ambassadors for boxing, separate from just the fights that end up on a pro record. So anyway, moving forward, this Langford's 1914. I'm sorry I didn't have 1913 loaded. Going on into 1915. Now, Langford's been fighting a long time. He's arguably getting past his prime year, and his results start to suffer a little bit because he's still fighting mad fights against big, tough guys. So he beats Battling Jim over 10 rounds. Then he loses to Jeanette over 12 rounds. Then he goes up to Montreal, and it says no contest. I can't remember why it was a no contest. Sometimes if fighters weren't really going for the kill, certain refs would stop the fight. They would say, you're not going for it enough. It's a no contest. Officiating and the newspaperman, everything was pretty harsh on the boxers in these days because the greats had set very high standards. So then he fights Battling Jim again, gets the best. Then he loses to McVeigh on points in Boston over 12 rounds. He draws with Jack Thompson over 20 rounds in Denver. Then he draws with Sam McVeigh in Denver, and then he gets the best over 15 rounds in Denver. And I guess Colorado was a decision state, so he could get an official win on points instead of the newspapermen scoring. But when you do specific research, which I have been in few years before this, but concerning Langford, separate from the points decision, you can also read the newspaper accounts. The newspaper writers had their own opinions of if the ref who usually judged in these days, if there was judging, it was a ref doing it, not a panel of judges. They would give their opinion on the action of the fight, a write-up of the fight, or their opinion if it was the right decision. So there's supporting evidence. We don't have to just trust that, oh, the newspaper just generically said win on points, he automatically got the best. There are times when the wrong person got the decision or a draw was really considered robbing the credit from someone who clearly did best. It gets complicated. And that's why I think Langford, separate from being overshadowed by Johnson's battles with the White Hopes and that the societal outrage of the black heavyweight champion and fragile white masculinity, like, freaking out, Langford gets a little bit buried by that, but also because his career is complicated. Just this one year, like I've been talking all this, but he's still going. November, Sam McVeigh, again in New York, draw over 10 points, over 10 rounds. And then he loses to Harry Wills. And Harry Wills, he was winning and losing and drawing at the beginning of Harry Wills' ascension, but then later in his career, Wills could just get the best of him because Harry Wills was big. He was like 6'3.5". He weighed anywhere from 200 to I think he got up around 220 as he filled out, to his full adult strength and everything. So Wills could get the best of him, but Langford was kicking a whole bunch of other butts around this time. He was never an easy fight. Even when he was practically completely blind, he still went and won the heavyweight championship in Mexico, basically on feel. He hit so hard, and because he was so experienced, he could fight on feel, and he could knock people out on feel. Like they'd hit him because he was very tough, even when he was struggling with his eyesight and overweight. He was immeasurably tough. We just don't see it today, and he wouldn't be sanctioned after 1917 today. After he lost sight one eye, they wouldn't have probably let him fight. But he was. So okay, moving on. We went through his 1916, 1917. He doesn't stop. You see, that's the thing. So like he fights December 29th, he fights Bob DeVere, gets newspaper win in Montreal. That's December 29th, but it's obscured on my screen by the live thing. I can't see when his first fight the next year is, but you can see he's just ripping through fights. And this keeps going. And in let's see, where is it? So June 19th in Boston, big Fred Fulton, huge guy, big puncher, much heavier, much taller. He TKO'd him in 7. He went to the hospital, but that was June 19th. But he was back August 17th, knocking out Andre Anderson. Now he's got nerve damage in one eye, so he's severely impaired, his depth perception and stuff. But he still gets a win over the great Joe Jeanette over 12 rounds. Then he knocks out Andy Johnson in 2 rounds. Don't know who that is. Then he loses over 10 rounds to Harry Wills. Harry Wills is taking over now. Like, it's his day. He's the key guy. Langford's one of the guys just below him. So he loses twice to Wills on the trot. But then he knocks out Kid Norfolk, a great fighter in his own right, in 2 rounds to close out the year. So he's capable of great wins with one eye. This is part of why I rate him so highly, is because let me go to the comments here real quick. And thanks for sticking around, guys who are here, and thanks to everyone for listening afterwards. Listen to me rant. I love talking about just prize fighting in general, but the old school. You can see the careers. Just reading through the careers, it's like you could barely add any information. It still feels in depth because they did so much. So let's see. Aliu, am I saying that right? Aliu? I'll just say AM. AM says Cyberbox Zone has Mike Casey archive. Great writer. He wrote a lot about a lot of the great fighters and gave some interesting stories about them. Oh, he's one of the authors of the things they have there. Yeah, I love reading through the descriptions on Cyberboxing Zone. Everybody go there and check it out. There are a lot of different sites, but for me, BoxRec and Cyberboxing Zone, for different reasons, are my go-to sources for online information outside of the newspaper archives, which I pay to belong to, and then I go find the original sources. But I'm going to find, with some exceptions, I'm going to find a lot of the stuff that was sourced to build these websites, along with like the Police Gazette and other things. But in the early era, the newspapers are the best, some of the best sources. That's interesting, Nick. Fred Fulton, one of only 6 fighters to have fought the great Langford and Greb. Let me think. So, okay. So it's quizzes time. Quizzes. So Fred Fulton, Jack Blackburn, absolutely scrapbook, 100%, my friend. I got to thank you and BL especially put a lot of this enthusiasm in me that's now like set my hair on fire and just got me digging in digital archives and just trying to wrap my brain around these careers. So Scrap, you might know this. So who are the 6 fighters to fight Langford and Greb both? There's Fred Fulton and Jack Blackburn. I got that. Who else fought who did Greb fight that Langford fought? Gunboat Smith. All right, so Fulton, Blackburn, Gunboat Smith. Help me out, guys. Who else? Let me think. Who else in Greb's resume that's in Langford's? Flowers. See, I'm confused. I'm gonna end up confusing myself. Well, you guys will probably figure it out, but I do know Fulton, Blackburn, and Gunboat. They definitely were on both. Pretty awesome stuff. So let's see. So we're up to 1917. So like, I don't even know if I have 1918, but his, even though now, like the second half of this year, he's now blind in one eye, but he keeps trucking. And you can fast forward to what was considered his comeback year, right? Where he got even a little more trim than he'd been. This is 1920. Look at this. And Nick and Scrap, I know you guys know, some of the listeners, the regulars to Scrap's channel and BL's channel, you guys know already, but look at this. This is 1920. Sam Langford's been fighting since 1902. He's been, as he enters 1920, he's been basically blind in one eye for 2.5 years. And he has all these fights. And you can see in there, among these fights, Jeff Clark, Harry Wills, Jeff Clark again, Sam McVeigh, Bearcat Wright, Big Bill Tate, Lee Anderson, Jack Thompson earlier too, George Godfrey, the second George Godfrey, not the smaller Canadian all-time great of the early era, George Godfrey. This is the later Leaperville Shadow, who I think he was from the South, but he, I can't remember where he's from, maybe Alabama, but Leaperville, PA, I think they moved up. They came up to the north, but his family, but George Godfrey, or his family might have stayed there and he just fought out of Leaperville. I'm not sure. But George Godfrey, an enormous person, and Langford knocks him out in 2 rounds. Langford has no business beating younger, huge guys or even being competitive, like in April you see he loses to Wills in Denver in altitude, but he goes the distance. So even when he's like, this was a time in his career when he was calling out people like Jack Dempsey who wouldn't fight him. That's the thing too, where you can judge someone's greatness by how much they avoided, as long as they're doing a lot of work separate from that. Like he didn't need a Jack Dempsey on his career, and some of these guys to have probably the greatest CV of all time, or one of the top 2 or 3. But it does say something when someone like Dempsey says that Langford was the only guy who ever scared him. That counts for a lot. Norfolk, John Lester Johnson. That's who it was. I was thinking of Keith Norfolk. John Lester Johnson. He was from Mobile, Alabama. Oh, let's see. Gunboat, Willie Meehan, Tiger Flowers, Kid Norfolk, Chappie Blackburn, Fred Fulton. Yeah, okay. So it was Willie Meehan, yeah. Tiger Flowers, Kid Norfolk. See, these are all. Thanks, Nick. Oh, did John Lester Johnson also fight them both? I can't remember. I'm not as familiar with Langford's late career, unless that's something else you mentioned. But yeah, Mobile, Alabama. I think Joe Louis was from Alabama. Was he not? Scrap? I mean, a lot of great fighters come out of the South, But anyway, I don't have all of Langford's years, and he fought on until 1926, although he trailed off in 25, 26. He barely fought, but you can just see here, and I'm going to get off soon. I'm going to jump off soon. But you can see here, like, long past his best. He was fighting a sea of killers, so. And at this point, yeah, he might have been 190 pounds, 200 pounds at times when he was out of shape, but he was so stocky, and he still had that punch. So there are other fighters who keep their punch past their prime. Some guys like Rocky Marciano, he was having some back problems. He retired before you really got to see him like fully out of his prime and lose. But it would have happened if he kept fighting. If he fought into his 40s, yeah, Rocky would have Lafayette, really, or Lafayette, Alabama. Oh, that's a town in Alabama Joe Louis is from. Yeah, the South was producing tough people. Although a lot of them in boxing, a lot of people come up north for opportunity, especially in like racially charged times, From my understanding, later after this, after World War II, a lot of soldiers coming home after serving their country, they weren't about to put up with some bumpkin shit, and they came up the river and they moved to the city. So a lot of talent migrated from the South up north, whether it's sporting talent or otherwise. Because people are kind of sick of that, like feeling like there wasn't any gratitude for like this tremendous sacrifice. They're overseas, seeing their friends get blown to pieces, trying to fight for a cause, and they come home getting no respect. So, Joe Louis, I know you've mentioned. Oh, don't worry about the spelling, Scrap. Just be safe. Thanks so much for listening. It's a pleasure talking. Knowing you're listening, I appreciate your feedback. I have great respect for your knowledge. I'm learning all the time. And I really need to do a video of recommendations of your videos that I would recommend people go and see, because you have hundreds and hundreds. So many, it's hard to navigate, but I have some favorites I'd like to shout out. I think I'm going to do a video maybe later tonight. I'm off overnight. I got to work my day job, then I'm off. So if I can find a time to sleep, I'll do one of those. So Langford makes a fantastic pound for pound all-time great argument. Scrap, I know you have him number one all time. I have him number one all time for whatever that's worth. And I know BL has him number one all time. A lot of people have him very high within the top 5 pound for pound fighters of all time, along with some of the other guys that people like to put right at the very, very, very top. All for good reason. Some of them have slightly smaller careers, like Robinson and Hank Armstrong, Harry Greb, Sam Langford. They have gigantic careers. Guys like Tony Canzoneri, Archie Moore, enormous, just reams of fights against the best of rich eras. And then you have guys like Ali, who has a slightly shorter career, but what a great career. And then when you narrow it down to heavyweight, Joe Louis and Ali, those resumes stack up to anybody's. But Langford's, it's almost like if you distill other boxers' careers as much as you have to Langford's to make it digestible, they barely have a career. Well, that might sound a little harsh. Let me see if I can put that in. we'll put it this way. Okay, so the great Joe Louis, right? 13 fights against Hall of Famers. He won 10 of them. That's incredible. 10 Hall of Fame wins is extremely impressive, especially for a heavyweight fighter. That's more than a lot of great heavyweights ever got. So he's 10-3, but you know, a tremendous record against rated fighters and top 3 fighters, right? And Ali, I think, is 11-3 against Hall of Famers. So even slightly better record. Great, slightly smaller, but great record against top 10 and top 3 fighters. And honestly, in Muhammad Ali's era, being top 10 and top 3 in that era probably means a bit more than it did in Joe Louis's era, as far as how many just really great fighters were all in that mix there. And it's not to diss Louis's era, because he was more dominant than Ali, really. If you look at the career, like, he had the one loss, but like in his prime, it was like ridiculous. He was so dominant. He was in the conversation with Sugar Ray Robinson and Langford and guys like that as the all-time greats. Joe Gans, like certain select few who just in those decades were mentioned amongst the very greatest ever. But Langford's, oh my goodness, let me see if I think I might have put it, there's a limit on how many pictures you can have loaded into a single brand on StreamYard, and I ran out earlier. I hit the 100 mark. Yeah, so here's one of the slides from the Boxing Librarian's excellent, most recent Sam Langford career breakdown, which I recommend everyone go find. Just type in Sam Langford career and look for that color background in the thumbnail. Go watch it. So you can see they had some wins against Hall of Famers. Sam Langford has 27 wins against Hall of Fame fighters and 17 draws against Hall of Fame fighters, and then 19 losses. Many of those losses came to Harry Wills when Langford was far past his prime, but not all of them. But 27 wins, so he has more wins over Hall of Famers than Ali and Joe Louis combined. And a lot of those 27 were against heavyweight Hall of Famers. Not all. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking Sam Langford. We're talking about this ridiculous, ridiculous career. And so we don't have like ring ratings for the pre-ratings era. That's why we call it the pre-ratings era. But the Boxing Librarian it must have been an incredible amount of work and did pound for pound ratings for, I think he did 1900. He might have gone back after that and did 1890 on, but I know for sure he did 1900 to I think it was 22 or 23. Sam Langford was pound for pound top 10 13 of those years. 13 years in his career, which might be the most in the database, you know, in the Boxing Librarian's database in his work. And this is vast. No one else put this work in. So I do put a lot of weight on this because you know, I'd like to see someone else do it. And not some automated BS. I mean, really go through and do it like BL did. Otherwise, I'm going to defer to his expertise. So just to get a sense of you know, and Langford had 25 wins over men who appeared in those pound for pound ratings and 63 fights against pound for pound fighters. That's, when you look at other careers, there's some great careers that don't even come to a fraction of that. He beat 10 individuals who had made the pound for pound list. So we're really talking about an all-time great fighter who proved it against all-time greats. But look at this stat. This is a stat that casual fans can appreciate. 127 knockouts. 127 knockouts from one pair of fists belonging to the great Sam Langford. 127. Not the most of all time, but it's up there, very close to Archie Moore. There's another fighter with a less prominent career at even more, but you know, you're looking at like Sam Langford and Archie Moore amongst the all-time greats. Those are the guys, the knockout kings, the finish kings. Archie did it more with combinations, and he was just a finisher. He'd push you right off the cliff if he had you close. Langford had one punch knockout power and fought more fights. So he was able, even against his competition, he was able to get that many. He actually had 53 knockouts in 3 rounds or less. Think about that. 53. So I was looking earlier, there's a lot of discussion with Fury. The great Lennox Lewis comes up and stuff, but I'm pretty sure he had about 44 fights as a pro. Lennox Lewis did. Great fighter. One of the all-time greats and the greatest of his era, but he didn't even have as many fights as Langford had, knockouts in 3 rounds or less. You know, Langford had, I guess, 15 in the first round, 15 knockouts against champions. And, you know, in Langford's day, becoming a champ was like a mythical thing because there were so many great fighters compared to how many belts there were and how many weight classes there were. So 15 knockouts over champs, 12 knockouts over Hall of Famers, and 20 knockouts in title fights. Those would be in the colored. He was the colored middleweight champion. He was a 5-time colored heavyweight champion. 20 of those wins in all those title fights were knockouts. It's incredible. We got a bunch of comments. Let's see what's going on over here in the comments. Oh, Bruce in the house. Good morning, Bruce. What's up, brother? All those names are my top 10 greatest fighters of all times. Yeah, Scrap. Those guys I mentioned with the giant CVs, right? Where you have Langford, Greb, Robinson, Armstrong, Canzoneri, Archie Moore. And most people, even people who give a lot of credit to the super old school Muhammad Ali, still needs to, you know, at least within the top 20 probably, because there are some monster careers. Guys I'm not as familiar with, guys like Jack Britton, Ted Kid Lewis, Johnny Dundee. Some of these guys had enormous careers, and that can't be ignored, even though I'm not as familiar with them. They have their own texture, just like all these guys. Oh, Scrap's dropping some knowledge on us. Here we go. 62 colored championship belts. Scrap, do you know, did he have just the one fight for the middleweight colored championship? I know that most of his work was for the heavyweight colored championship, but I had meant to clear that up. Oh, Billy Bird. Yeah, Nick, good call. Billy Bird, London welterweight. One more KO than Archie Moore. Wow. And I think Peter Maher had a lot of, the Irish Giant, didn't he? He had an awful lot of knockouts. I don't think he had that many as them, but a lot. I think Joe Gans had maybe 99 knockouts himself. The great lightweight who also fought at welterweight. He actually fought the great Barbados Joe Walcott for the welterweight championship. Well, it was supposed to be, but then last minute it wasn't for the championship, and they fought to a draw. But Scrapbook says, yeah, Langford had over 40 colored championship defenses. Defenses. Oh, Nick says 2 defenses of the middleweight title, I think. Yeah, I need to look that up because I'm not even sure who he won the middleweight title against, because he fought others, guys who were weight jumpers themselves. So I'm not always clear on what's for what title. That's all part of the learning experience. I spent like especially last year and a half, but like pretty much like last 3+ years going through in my spare time trying to study Langford. And I'm just getting more familiar with the first part of his career. This part of the overall scope of his career is still something I'm very much studying, you know, as best as time allows. I'm pretty busy outside of my love for prize fighting, so just doing what I can. But certainly, like, the argument for Langford to be all 4 of these guys here, Jack Johnson, Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, I have all 4 of those inside my top 10 heavyweights of all time. And that's not necessarily a bias. That's just looking at who they fought and the level of fighter that they were in the ring against, and then comparing their success to who they fought. There are lots of guys who have very clean records who didn't fight at the level, because these are guys who fought a lot at Hall of Fame level, like all-time greats, just like you would give a lot of credit to Ali for fighting the Hall of Famers he fought and won and lost to. You know, he didn't go undefeated against Hall of Famers himself. Same with Joe Louis. But when you talk about people who are enshrined as like greats across all the generations, Langford's body of work is crazy. But all 4 of these guys have extremely respectable bodies of work, to put it mildly. And the argument for them, now Johnson, a lot of people, he's just more famous than the others nowadays because he held the establishment title, and because the way the boxing community talks about boxing history, they don't talk about the colored heavyweight championship as a world title, but it was literally the colored world heavyweight title. And in the newspapers in that day, at the end of the year, when they would recap the year, they would mention all the different world titles that changed hands. And voila, the world colored heavyweight championship was mentioned right next to the world title. And then in the other weight classes, at least in the early years of Langford's career, they didn't mention if there were other colored championships like the middleweight. They didn't necessarily mention that because sometimes those claims weren't defended, or there was, for whatever reason. But the heavyweight division was important. So Jack Johnson was in the paper. Denver Martin was in the paper as colored heavyweight world champions before Johnson won the world, the establishment title in 1908. And that's partly why Langford's so underrated, because anyone who has 40 plus world title fights, yeah, you obviously got to put him in the conversation. But if people don't even know that they were considered world title fights at the time, because of the racial politics in the years when black men they just were refused a world title shot, those colored belts were often more hotly contested than the world title. I mean, Johnson didn't get a step up fighting Tommy Burns. People wanted him to fight Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh. Burns was a powerful fighter, but that wasn't like the toughest fight. That was the guy who had the title, who had won the title, but who he wanted it from. But it's all good. We give him a credit today, even if they didn't he doesn't get enough acclaim. We can certainly change that. Not every great sportsman or artist is celebrated the same way in their day or just after. People have revivals, like Van Gogh, the painter. He wasn't always considered an all-time great painter, and he died broke. To my understanding, he was getting money from his family to survive. Nowadays, his paintings are amongst the most valuable in the world, and he's celebrated as an all-time great. Johann Sebastian Bach, the patriarch of the whole Bach lineage, with over 50 composers over the centuries. Johann Sebastian Bach fell out of favor. He came back into favor, and now he's considered, not just like the father of the tempered scale, which I won't even get into, but like not the father, but the man who really worked it out, but which is a frequency adjustment. So you can play in all keys. It's too much to get into. I'll do that on a music chat or something. But Bach, the way he's known now, he wasn't always that prominent. So same thing with Sam Langford, certain fighters. Ezra Charles, I've heard that he was like that. There was a time when he wasn't properly appreciated, but now with the internet and people able to find this information, certain people are getting revival and popularity. That doesn't mean people are building them up needlessly after the fact, though. That just means as we have access to information to find out what people did, we have every right to reserve our own judgment on where they stand all time. Like Jack Dempsey is a great heavyweight, right? Super famous, but he ducked Harry Wills so hard, and Harry Wills has a better resume. So for me, I rank Harry Wills inside the top 10 all time. I don't have Dempsey inside 10, although I do rate him highly. But across all time, Wills makes it in. And you look at his resume and who he fought and who he's willing to fight. And in those years, an unbusy champion was getting way outworked by some of the top contenders. They were doing a ridiculous amount, including some of the champions before they became champion. Before he was the champ, Jack Johnson had a crazy run. Before he was the champ, Jack Dempsey was putting that work in. Then he fought less often, even if it was high level. So yeah, here's some guys with monster resumes here. This is actually from when I tried to crack the BL code. I tried to predict the Boxing Librarian's updated top 1,000. I tried to predict the top 15. But these 6 guys, the CVs these particular gentlemen have, starting top left, hammering Hank Armstrong, great Sugar Ray Robinson, top center. Top right, Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum, another insane CV. The list of notable opponents just goes on and on and on forever. Hundreds of fights, the total career. I think he had almost 300 fights. Bottom left, Tony Canzoneri. Kanzi was a beast, and he was not only 5-time undisputed champion, across 3 weights, but he was not only 5-time undisputed champion, but his overall CV is ridiculous. I have him inside my top 10 all time. Sam Langford, bottom center. Begging Sam. In spite of all the greats he fought, he still didn't get to fight a bunch of people he challenged because they were either flat out scared of him or they just had a competition reluctance. They didn't want the loss on the record, even if they weren't actually scared to get beat up or to be in a tough fight. Bottom right, Harry Greb, who a lot of people consider a top 4, but it's a lot of people even a top 2 or the top fighter of all time. Harry Greb, just like Langford, fought against lots of opponents he had no business beating and beat a lot of asses that way. Ridiculous level. And in fact, Greb, to my understanding, has the most wins over the most individual Hall of Famers that he beat. And at 15 in the ring, I think it's 14 plus Jack Blackburn, who's in there as a coach, should be in as a fighter, but he's number 1. I think Jimmy McLaren is number 2. Langford's pretty close up there, though. Hank Armstrong, some of these guys are really close, but Greb's the king of that. Greb also has the most wins over Hall of Fame opponents. Langford is number 2. Robinson's number 3. The great Ezzard Charles is number 4. Robinson has 21. Ezzard Charles has 20. So you talk about the internet age giving someone their due credit. Yeah, you got to give Ezzard Charles a lot of credit because he's only 4th all time in how many wins he got over Hall of Fame fighters. Just 4th in the history of boxing. Let's see. Nick says, the information available now is second to none. In my day, I had to wait for the boxing news periodicals and books from libraries just to get snippets of info. Yeah, Nick, I got to say, I'm kind of grateful that I got into boxing when I did and that I wasn't into it. I mean, okay, I take that back. It would have been fun to be following all along, but it's gratifying that when I decided to research, I can go between these 2 newspaper archives that I pay to subscribe to. It's like probably 100, like tens of millions of articles, at least like tens of millions of pages of newspapers and millions from the years that I've been looking at. So Sam Langford, I searched for Langford in one of those archives. It turns up like 700,000 hits on his name. And most of them are his name and not guys later on who took his name. Because there's like young Sam Langford and there's probably all different versions of his name, just like with Joe Gans and certain other fighters where people would use a version of their name. Corbett, they're actually, there's Gentleman Jim and then there's 3 young Corbett's, I think, in the Hall of Fame. They all had Hall of Fame careers. I think you guys might be able to correct me on that, Scrap and Nick. Is that right? Young Corbett, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd are all Hall of Fame fighters. Incredible. So it shows you the influence of that. There have been a whole slew of Joe Gans, Baby, Panama, all different versions of Joe Gans' name. There were some other Langfords, although not as many as Gans. Gans was tremendously influential. But all great fighters. And Gans, I struggle where to put him because he had a ridiculous career himself. But to your point, Nick, yeah, it's wonderful to be able to go in. I get lost in the archives. I would do actually a lot more content on my channel if I wasn't kind of just lost in reading these articles and just trying to figure out how writers perceived boxers and how the kind of standard they were being held to. But long story short, and the conversation on Twitter, it's just a brief exchange on Twitter I had that prompted me to come on and do this now. I've been thinking about it while I was at work, was because the gentleman Rob had suggested, well, because Langford lost to Johnson and had some losses, he wasn't sure how to rate him at heavyweight. So I came on here. I don't know if it'll be painful for him to try and listen to this whole thing, but it prompted me to come on and talk about it. I love to talk fights. But Langford losing to Johnson, I don't think hurts his career. It actually raised his stock at the time that he went full distance because he was so much smaller. And from what I've seen, it seemed like a lot of people were just betting not whether Langford would win. They were betting whether or not he'd last the full fight. I think it was a 15-round fight, if I'm not mistaken. So they were betting whether or not he would last the length, and he did. And he got cheers from the crowd afterwards. Like, they were really thrilled with the show of heart and the fact that he still laid into Johnson, even though he was getting jacked up, to where Johnson had to kind of shut him down. Johnson, brilliant defensive boxer, one of the great defensive boxers to ever live, and was able to shut him down. But he had to shut him down because Langford kept coming. Langford was a fierce character. And even though he was still pretty young in 1906 and he wasn't fully grown, he already had gigantic experience. Because he was so busy, he had more fights. I'm pretty sure he had more fights by the time he fought Johnson than Johnson had, although Johnson had more years and was a naturally bigger guy. Let's take a look at the comments. Oh, Hardline. What's up, brother? Yeah, Hardline is always Hardline Boxing Talk, the Boxing Librarian. Go check out this man's channel and Scrapbook Boxing's channel. Look at the content these guys put out. You could just get lost. I do get lost in there. Nice to see you here, buddy. Yo, Hardline, you could BL, you know you're invited if you want to come on. No pressure though, no pressure. Just great to see you here. And Scrap and Nick. Andre, good morning, sir. Good afternoon. I'm not sure where you are, but good morning, afternoon. Great to have you here. It's a bit early for Rodolfo, otherwise he'll be here. Bruce, nice to see you here, sir. Everybody, just nice to have people stop by. I'm very well, thank you, Hardline. And just, to be explicitly clear for people listening after the fact, so Hardline Boxing Talk, this is the Boxing Librarian. This is the mythical BL that I reference a lot. But I usually say Boxing Librarian or BL instead of Hardline as a shorthand. But this is the man who inspired me to study Langford in the first place. And that was greatly assisted by Scrapbook Boxing. These channels, I owe these guys. And we're actually, while I got you both here, I mentioned earlier, but let me mention once again, yeah, it seems like we're going to count down the top 10 middleweights of all time. Now, guys, are we going to do it like the other live chats we did, like the top 5 grab years and the top 10 heavyweights, the first quarter of the 1900s? Are we going to do this with no set criteria to keep it interesting so we don't actually know what we're aiming for precisely? Andre, great to have you here in the chat, sir. Because I'm down for that BL and Scrap. If you guys want to just do what I consider like a floating criteria, meaning you can set your own criteria and make a list. We're not answerable to anyone, or like nothing to measure against, because I really enjoyed that with I thought our live chat on the top 10 greatest heavyweights 1900 to 1925 came out better for us not having set a criteria. Ooh, pound for pound fighter of decades video done. Yeah, Hardline. Let me put that up on the screen. Definitely. Always fascinating to see what you're working on, Hardline. You are a machine. You and Scrap put out so much content. It's, I've been doing like some live chat, doing long videos, long live chats, which I like to do. I got a big mouth. I love to talk. But just the frequency you're putting out all this amazing content. And I've got some I've seen in my come up in my notifications I haven't had a chance to sit down and watch and give their proper attention to. But I really enjoyed that Denver and Martin, and I think it was like a week or two ago you put up the young Peter Jackson career. I think it was young Peter Jackson. You did his career video. I think I need to build a playlist on my channel of your pre-ratings era videos, the ones that I love the most. And same with you, Scrap. There's some of the ones you talk about, some of these memory lane style videos. Okay, great, Scrap. Yeah, so we'll just set our own criteria and then just do the thing. We'll get together and I'll try and make sure I have a good sense of maybe the general pool of 40 or so guys who might make that all-time list. So I'll make graphics up for all of them. So hopefully I'll cover, so that way you don't have to, because I know, Scrap, you like to keep it close to your chest, and I like that as a surprise. Sometimes me and BL will tell each other our list in the back. Sometimes not. So we'll see how this one goes. But yeah, no pressure on the criteria. It could be anything. Just for your own person, because I respect both you guys. I respect your opinion as much as anyone on this planet when it comes to boxing. So, who am I to set a criteria on you? You set your own criteria for for the term greatest and go with that. And that stands up with me. Like I mentioned earlier, BL, about your pound for pound rankings, pre-ratings era pound for pound rankings. Well, I trust those. I go by those. Now, if I went fight to fight, I don't know if I would come up with a different one, but I trust yours because no one's done that work. You did the work. You put the work in, so you're the authority on that, as far as I'm concerned, until someone else even tries to compete with it. And not some automated thing. I mean, like, you put the work in. You must have. It was. I still put that on, that whole playlist on, and just listen to it at work sometimes. Your whole 1900 to I think it was 1923. So yeah, so scrapbook's down for the floating criteria. Floating meaning we can shift it around at our whim. And actually, our last talk, that was kind of funny. We were doing our countdown of the top 10 heavyweights, 1900 to 1925. We were changing our mind during the talk. I know I changed mine. BL, you changed yours right before the talk. And Scrap had to demote Dempsey and promote Jeanette, because as we were all talking through, I think we were influencing each other because we're laying out complicated arguments, contrasting vastly different textures, career to career. BL says I'm working on my third part of my title record series. I'm adding the pre-rating era champs to create an all-time top 50 title records. I've been waiting for that. For the uninitiated listeners, BL has done, did you do the alphabet era first? I think he did the top 50 alphabet era champs, and then you did the top 50 ratings era champs. I might be confused, but now you're doing the pre-ratings era champs. And let me tell you guys, some of these champs, they really got it on. They really got their championship stuff on. So I'm looking forward to that. Wow, you got so much going on. But I know in and around there, you'll get on your middleweight list, because I know how your brain works. You're going to be alpha then, right? You're going to, all of us, we got a thirst, an academic thirst that can only be quenched by producing a top 10 middleweights list and then talking about it for 3 or 4 hours. Nick says it's something to look for. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this too. I appreciate you guys joining me, and for at least some of you is the morning, or the others, if you're in the UK, I guess it's the early to mid afternoon, but thanks for joining. Yeah, I'm looking forward to all these projects. Scrap's asking, and the criteria, yeah. Oh, so it was 80. I was trying to remember earlier if you did 1890 or if I confused myself and it was 1900 you went back to. Yeah, that's right, because you added 2 videos at the end of the playlist in 1890 to get you through 1894 and then through 99. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's one of my favorite resources on the whole internet are those pound for pound rankings, because it's the era I'm most interested in, and it's the era with the least structural analysis. And what you've done is really important work, BL. And so you did the alphabet, then ring era. Now it's time. So it was alpha. Yeah, all time's going to be crazy. Langford, Wills, Johnson, Attell, on and on. Oh my goodness, yeah. Gans, Leonard. Oh wait, no, Leonard was ratings era, I guess, was he? I don't think I saw the last one of your ratings era, so I might have missed. I need to catch up. I've been working a lot. Okay, good. So we're gonna do. So it's on. We're in there. I have to say, I think it's time for. I think I have to get off soon. I think my wife just woke up. I need to sleep. I also want to cook a nice breakfast. I've been gone all night. I wanted to jump on and have. If left to myself, I'd be on this for another 2 hours talking boxing. I think this is enough. This was actually supposed to be just a very short talk on why I consider Langford at least worthy of being in that conversation, but this has turned into something much, much richer. Goodness me, you got so much stuff. Yeah, well, you're welcome for the compliments, BL. You've earned them. This, you know what, you and Scrapbook and other guys too. Like I have a lot of respect too. 86 Boxing. I've been talking to him. We might have a collaborative project coming up. He's doing stuff on the old school fighters, like animated cartoons stuff, but like going through fight to fight, giving a lot of credit to the old school. It's wonderful to see more and more of it. But you guys are, you guys are on fire and inspiring a lot of people to do their own version. And just so you know, BL, you get shout outs on his podcast from 86 Boxing. Shouts you out as someone who's put that work in. He talks up your rankings as well. So you are appreciated by people who appreciate this stuff. You are appreciated, sir. Andre, I want to say beyond random, the major responsible for the motivation of mine doing this work. Andre, right on, brother. I'm in that same boat. Same boat. Yeah, absolutely. Your guys' passion translates to passion. And I got, when I initially wanted to become a guitarist, it wasn't really so much from, it was like my friend showed me a C major chord and played me a bunch of really cool rock and roll, some of which I already was familiar with, but we started a band. That's when I really became really passionate about guitar. Someone else's passion infused my spirit. And that's what happened with boxing. This was decades ago. I'm old as hell, but in a similar way, the 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 passion with which you advocate, both you guys, Scrap and BL, you advocate for the early era boxers, the respect they deserve, the serious respect they deserve, that sometimes exceeds what other boxers have even can approach doing. The respect they deserve for that sort of put me in a mindset to be like, well, let me check this out because they're very serious about this. But anyway, oh, Andre, I put that up on the screen. I got to get off. My wife just called for the second time. I'm trying to get into a thing here and go make breakfast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to everyone after the fact. I might jump on later tonight to get back to the more Sam Langford talk. But for now, I'm going to sign off. Thank you, everybody. Take care.